Right, at this time, I would like to welcome the panel for our second conversation of this morning. This panel will be discussing some of the threats facing the Bay Area, physical and otherwise, and how worried we should be about those threats. Some of them are things that we think about often, like earthquake or sea level rise, but there are others that may surprise you. So this morning we have moderating our conversation is Ed Baxter, who's the anchor for the Bloomberg Global News Network and a member of the Bay Area Radio Hall of Fame. So please join me in welcoming Ed Baxter and our panelists.
So that's me now, I guess. Everything working? How you guys? Everybody all right? Glad to be here. What we want to do is make this kind of short and quick, get to you guys as quickly as we can. But this, as he said, is short and long-term risks to the Bay Area. Earthquakes, climate change, sea level rise. We had a pre-conference call, and one of the things that we'll get to is we're not just talking earthquakes and sea rise. We're talking about cyber attacks. And I saw moving on, if I can do a short, and this is not going to be a commercial for Bloomberg, on Bloomberg this morning, that the acting FBI director in front of the Senate now is saying that he expects continued hacks into government and into business from the Russians, that they're really there. So, that becomes one of the risk factors. So, we're going to talk about the Bay Area's well-being, and let's just go with it. The bios are in the program. So you guys have probably already looked at that. Let's go with Robin Grossinger, Resilient Landscapes Program Director, San Francisco Estuary Institute. Robin? Yeah.
Thank you. Glad to be here. So I just have a few minutes, and I'm going to try to make a few points about the environment and our relationship to the environment and how that's a big part of resilience. So the idea, my main point will be that we actually need to make investments in making our ecosystems higher functioning systems to contribute to the sort of essential foundation for resilience for the region. So that there needs to be a greater bridge between business and the environment, and that's part of the underlying resilience that creates that ability to adapt within our region. So I'll give a few examples. So I think as many of us know, the environment is going to be a bigger challenge in the coming decades than it's been in the past. For example, sea level rise, as most people in this audience know, I'm sure, threatens neighboring cities, businesses, residences, but then also many of the things we all depend on, from airports to sewage treatment plants, highways. So really, even though it's just the edge of the bay, it addresses the kind of operational viability of many aspects of the region. It's easy to forget that there are 300 creeks around the edge of the bay that flow through our neighborhoods and cities. And the predictions, while there's some uncertainty about this aspect of climate change, it's considered likely that there'll be greater frequency of big storms and bigger storms in the future. So the issue of flooding alongside all of these nice creeks that flow through our neighborhoods is going to be a greater and greater challenge. Another aspect that's easy to forget about but very fundamental is just increased heat waves, heat stress, the health risks in our neighborhoods and cities of just increasing temperatures and increasing extreme temperatures. And the way we've designed our cities tends to, rather than modulate or reduce those effects, tends to magnify them, because we have so much impervious surface and kind of concrete that warms up. And we don't tend to build out the urban canopy as effectively as we could in terms of bigger trees, in terms of drought-resistant trees. So we're actually getting a lot of die-off of trees, as people have probably noticed, particularly redwoods, a lot of other trees that were planted for more moist conditions, often drawn from the East Coast, where we love the fall color, right? So that's a whole nother dimension, how we design our neighborhoods. And then In addition, I think it's important to think about the loss potentially of biodiversity and ecosystem functions in the Bay, in the surrounding wildlands, really an aspect of the Bay Area that we take for granted or really assume as part of the quality of life, the experience of being in the Bay Area, sort of the healthy outdoors aspect. So those ecosystems are going to be greatly challenged in the future by these increasingly rapid shifts in climate. So that's another part of the challenge. And I think all of these things underlie, actually I don't want to go there yet, all of these things underlie really all aspects of experiencing the Bay Area, of our quality of life, our health, so the operational viability of many dimensions depend, when you think about it, on the environment and its sort of good functioning. So that's the negative part. But the positive part is that we can actually build up that resilience. And that resilience is, in the ecosystem, is a fundamental part of the overall package of resilience that we're talking about here. So this is our version of a classic diagram that shows how social and economic and infrastructure, all these different aspects of resilience are overlapping or intertwined. And so if I highlight here the ecology side, that affects engineering, that affects social systems. So again, the point that that's part of building our resilience. So I'll show a few examples. So marshes are the natural way to buffer our shorelines from sea level rise. Marshes, beaches, mudflats, they all knock down the waves as they approach, as they get bigger over time. So having those marshes there is part of building a resilient system. But to do that, we actually need to deliver sediment to them so they can keep rising vertically, which of course is a big part of, is going to depend significantly on the dredging community and how we work that partnership. And BPC has been a big part of that so far. So, as well as how we manage our watersheds and the sediment coming out of streams and stuck in reservoirs, that all contributes to the resilience of the shoreline and how much we have to invest in building levees higher. How we manage the creeks. As we can rebuild trails and floodplains alongside the creeks, that reduces the risks of flooding. It also increases a lot of things that people want in their neighborhoods. Urban forests, we can proactively improve those over the next generation so that they reduce heat, provide shade, also store carbon. There's an increasing look at urban forests as a way to store carbon. And interestingly, coast live oak, one of our most important native trees, stores more carbon per year than almost all the trees we use in urban areas. So there's tremendous lift potential if we look at urban areas and try to create them as resilient systems in the future. So we call this landscape resilience. And as I close, the idea is that reestablishing this adaptive capacity in our landscapes, in the sort of underlying systems that we depend on for clean air, clean water, risk reduction, temperature reduction, sort of quality of life, investing in those will help the region, both the health of people and nature. That's been greatly diminished over time. We've done a good job preserving some areas, but not necessarily interweaving those ideas or principles within sort of our business operations and our building of cities. So there's some work to be done, but I think that resilience can be strengthened. And to me, one of the big opportunities is that we are always replacing and redesigning the infrastructure. And arguably, and you guys may know more about this than I do, a lot of that infrastructure, a lot of that kind of underlying sort of landscape is going to be redesigned or rebuilt in the next couple decades. You think about a lot of our post-World War II infrastructure in terms of flood protection, in terms of, interesting, much of the canopy, urban canopy went in the 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of these things are nearing the end of their 50 to 75 year time frame, lifespan. So we're going to be redoing these things. The shoreline's going to have to be adapted a lot as sea levels rise. So we might as well take this next shot at creating the next generation infrastructure for the region, which is resilient shorelines, is resilient urban forests, flood systems, water systems. So I'll end with a quick plug for a recent report we put out, Landscape Resilience Framework, which kind of is our way of thinking about these ideas and sort of moving forward. So that's available on our website. Thank you.
Okay. Stay there, Robin. I'm going to break format already. Okay, that's why my bosses always hate me in radio. I want to ask you one quick question, and really general. And I just have made you the god of your universe there. We get loaded with a lot of stuff that we have to do. You pick one project you want done right now. I give you the money. What do you do?
Well, I think the big one that we're all fans of and that is kind of ready to go is South Bay Salt Ponds, right? That's been designed, everyone supports it, and we have some of the money to do it. It protects Silicon Valley significantly from flooding, from sea level rise. It's a huge lift for the ecosystem, and I think it's largely awaiting the money.
Yeah.
What is that, $500 million, something like that?
Okay, and we'll try to find out if there are any ideas where we get that. Thank you very much, Robin. Next up is Brad Benson, who is the Director of Special Projects for the Port of San Francisco. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. It's great to be here at Bay Planning Coalition having these great discussions. So I'm going to focus on seismic risk and sea level rise and associated flood risk. Port has been gearing up over the past couple of years to address our 3-mile seawall that really defines the Embarcadero between Fisherman's Wharf and the ballpark. Not many people even know that the port has a seawall. This is an unseen piece of infrastructure. This is San Francisco around the time of the gold rush. Shallow mud flats, not good access to the shoreline. People started filling in a sort of haphazard way to get out to deeper water. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the clicker. Until the state stepped in and formed the Board of State Harbor Commissioners to build a seawall and build a deep water harbor. And it really was a 4-decade effort from 1878 to 1916. The construction style was to go out to deep water, dredge about 100-foot wide in the bay mud, 20 feet deep, and then fill with rock to create a 40-foot high rock dike. And the land was filled behind, hundreds of acres of land filled behind the seawall. And then the piers that you see today and the bulkhead buildings are supported by piles driven through, in part, the rock dike. So that's the construction of the San Francisco waterfront. So we know there's a very high probability of an earthquake, 72% chance of a major earthquake in the next 30 years. Thinking about the type of earthquake that can happen, this is the only known seismograph in the world to capture both the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 and the 1906 earthquake. On the top, you see the little blip for Loma Prieta. On the bottom, you see the 1906 earthquake. It was 60 times stronger. Strong ground shaking for a minute. It was about 8 seconds of moderate shaking in 1989, so totally different events. We know from some of the photographic evidence that there was lateral spreading along the waterfront in 1906. These liquefiable soils sunk, moved bayward, and we're worried about the same thing going forward. So we've recently completed seismic analysis of the seawall. It's built on liquefiable, weak soils. We expect the land behind the seawall to liquefy, push bayward, and up to 3 to 5 feet of movement of the seawall in a major seismic event, and very significant damage to not only the port facilities along the waterfront, but utility infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and the like. We also love, Robin, that we use the same slide. That was great. So this is south of the ferry building. We have flood risk today. Embarcadero closing 1 or 2 lanes in some of these king tide events. We know it's going to get much worse. So under 24 inches, which is sort of the high scenario for 2050, we'd see up to 3 blocks of downtown subject to flood risk under a base flood event. When you get out to 2100 under the high scenarios, basically returning to the original San Francisco shoreline, if nothing is done. So we've got a lot at risk. We've got a historic district. It's the most visited area in the city, utility, transportation, infrastructure. There are ways to fix this problem. We are looking at either stabilizing the land behind the seawall, stabilizing the foundation of the seawall, maybe a new bayward seawall to solve this problem. And we think that this is going to be a complicated project. It's not just a gray infrastructure project. We're not going to be able to do what they did 100 years ago. We need to think about how we can improve bay habitat when we're building this project. What are the public benefits of a project like this? How is it adaptable to sea level rise over time? It's a $3 to $5 billion project. We can't afford it with local resources alone. We're looking at the federal and state level to help fund a project like this. We need to start building a coalition around the state to think about how communities finance projects like this. And so I will, I will leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Very much. Let me ask you a question. Just for me, looking at where the shoreline was, the one slide that you have there, I've worked all my life at KGO on the Embarcadero, at Front and Vallejo, and now on Pier 3 at Bloomberg. I mean, if there's a major event, we're in deep trouble, are we not?
Certainly if there's a major seismic event, not many of the areas along the waterfront have a stabilized seawall in front of them. The Pier 3 that you're in was seismically strengthened when that project was developed, so hopefully you're safe in that building. But we know we have a lot of risk here to address with this project.
So where do you start first? If I'll ask you the same question. If you had your first project, where do you start? What do you do first?
Well, our first thing is to make people aware of the problem. We have, this is not infrastructure that you see. We've done some focus groups around San Francisco. People don't even know that there is a seawall or there's a problem, and they don't understand how the damage resulting from this kind of earthquake could affect the local economy. So I think we want to start, like we are today, with educating people about the problem and the solutions. And we hope to go for a bond measure for local voters of about $350 million in November of 2018. So that'll be our first big step.
All right, good. Yeah, so the local money first, and then I guess everybody here and on the panel and everybody here is going to have to look to the federal government at some point, and that's a different can of worms, isn't it, these days? All right, let's go. Thank you very much, Brad. Appreciate that very much. Scot Ferrell is Managing Director, Marsh Risk Consulting. Scott.
Thank you. Appreciate the time today. When I was asked to speak on this panel, they said, we need somebody up there to talk a little bit about doom and gloom within the Bay Area. And so I said, yeah, I guess that's me. So my first slide, really, I wanted to bring this up so we can talk a little bit about the short-term and long-term risks within the Bay Area. And again, Ted did a good job of kind of outlining some things earlier today about the unanticipated demand or drop in certain areas. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the natural risks and the man-made risks of each one of these categories. And you look at some of the things that really can impact us right now. It's cyber breach. I mean, we're seeing companies held hostage by folks that get into your networks. I mean, it has a short-term risk, and everyone should look at this and say, my organization should get prepared for it. Of course, we've seen the slides on the earthquakes, on the natural disasters, the floods and so forth, and the seawalls and so forth. But that's where you also need to step back and say, hey, are we prepared? And also, you've had the political upheaval, which, with the new government in place, has raised some concern. We see a lot more aspects of people voicing their opinions in public, and it disrupts the businesses that we have. So again, it's something you need to think about and plan. And most of these areas that we're taking a look at, it's really based on an individual basis. Each organization has their own risks and concerns, and each organization needs to prepare individually for that response. So, overall, if you look at these things happen on a short-term basis, you need to have a plan in place. And first, you need to identify what those risks are, how they impact your organization, but then you need to have a plan of response. So from a short-term perspective, that's how I look at it. From a long-term perspective, there's a lot of change in the economies right now. Internet has changed the way we do our shopping. If you look on the streets, you'll see less brick-and-mortar retail organizations. They're going bankrupt. It's one of those where you need to step back and take a look, well, how is that going to impact my organization over the next 5 to 10 years? We've done some studies and seen some results. We found the millennials, right now, when they go to the grocery store, it's about 17% of those folks shop online to have their groceries delivered to their home. They projected that should be about 65% in 5 years. So think of that, and then think about what your organization does, and are there technological changes that are going to be occurring that you might have to rethink the way you do your current business. We did talk about the sea level rise, and I think hopefully I'll learn some things here today. I find it's a big challenge. I don't know what the solutions are. Hopefully we can learn that today. But I know that there's some changing things on the artificial intelligence as well. We have autonomous vehicles that'll be coming out soon. Matter of fact, our organization just now put together a drone squad that helps organizations figure out how to manage their drones and what are the potential risks about using drones. And so some benefits, but sometimes benefits come, there are some key risks that are associated with those. So that's kind of some things to think about. And hopefully this, as you look at this slide, it'll generate some thoughts in your mind. So when we get to the discussion zone, we can have some good conversation. Now, I just posed a couple solutions for the insurable and non-insurable risks. And, one thing to kind of get a good handle on this is to do an enterprise-wide risk management program. Basically it's identifying all the risks within your organization and prioritizing them. And we find that that's a common occurrence and something you need to think about and do as well. But also looking at those threats and risks and vulnerabilities within your organization from a first-party perspective, meaning your own risks and threats, but also your third-party risks. How can they, if a failure of a third party, how does that impact you? So need to think about those types of things. And then through implementing loss control, there's always the standpoint, well, we can throw some insurance money at this, or at least pay for insurance to pay for those catastrophic losses that might occur. But there's other ways to mitigate that risk. And, through doing some business continuity planning, some crisis management planning, you maybe can eliminate or reduce the impact of those threats and risks that may occur to your program. So just thinking about some of those, I listed a couple other areas that are pretty common now. We're doing a lot of earthquake and flood modeling, just to understand what the exposures are for your organization. It kind of helps you understand how much planning you need to do and how do you prioritize all your risks and all these doom and gloom issues that are pending at your doorstep. So something to think about, and hopefully we'll talk more about this shortly when you have some questions.
Okay, hey, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott. Let me ask you the one question. You mentioned these things. All of us, are the big tech companies, let me just pull Google out of the air. I mean, this has to be a huge concern for the bigger tech companies as well as those of us who are running mid-sized business, small-sized businesses. I mean, are we calling to arms enough here? Are we alerted enough as to what can happen? We can see it all around us.
Well, it's a good question. And what we do see is there's high preparedness, or there's high thought around what to do next from the large organizations like the Google. They have departments in some cases that are focusing in on these issues. They know what it means to be redundant and resilient. I know there was a question about resiliency early on, where they're building their infrastructure to make sure that they have minimal downtime, which is what all organizations should think about. We're seeing the smaller organizations just really don't have the time and energy and resources to think about it. So that's where we see the biggest vulnerability is the smaller organizations.
Yeah, okay, all right, cool. And we will get back to that, Scott, because as a news guy, you see, we had the blackouts. I mean, it's a major risk to a threat to all of us, I think, if, we'll go there, if our energy systems or our grids are hacked. Ann Wein is the Operations Research Analyst for the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS.
Good morning. Right, so I am going to call people to arms, and I'm going to start with an earthquake, but it's going to touch on everything everyone else has already said. So it's going to involve the environment, particularly the environmental health of the Bay Area. It's going to involve critical infrastructure like the seawall, and it's going to involve all those short and long-term risks that Scott showed us, including access to the internet, fires, and other hazards that can follow an earthquake. So I am the project lead of this Haywide scenario project with Dale Cox, but I must say we have over 65 plus people who have already contributed in some way to the analysis of the scenario, and that is growing. I have personally worked with 65 people. Will this run? Oh, yeah. So I'm going to show you an animation of an earthquake. So USGS scientists and some other colleagues have figured out how they can actually simulate an earthquake through the 3 dimensions of the geology of the Bay Area. And there's a few of these, but this one in particular, has it started? Oh, what's happened to it? We can't see it all for some. It starts in Oakland. Are you able to get the other view to come up? Yeah. Oh, it was just that there was 2 parts to it, but that's okay. Okay, so it's the Hayward Fault's marked there, and it starts in underneath Oakland. And the first wave that's coming out is the P wave, so not as intense as what's about to follow. You'll see another wave come, the S wave, which is when you really get the strongest shaking. This is why earthquake early warning works, because you get some time before you get the heavy weight, the heavy shaking wherever you are. So that's coming down the road where you will be able to, hopefully the vision one day on your phone, see an earthquake in maybe 1, 2, 3, 10, 25 seconds, depending on where you are for this particular earthquake. So the red intensity there is a problem even for well-built buildings. So we're going to tell the story based from that science. Can I go to the next slide, please? So while the shaking's going on, there's other things happening as well. And that shaking is causing ground failure in the form of liquefaction and landslides. And thank you, Brad, you've already told everyone about liquefaction. So there's a photo there of Loma Prieta earthquake in the Marina District. So in particular, in that area in San Francisco, and also on the East Bay, where we've filled in the land, is very prone to liquefaction, buckling the pavements and breaking water pipes. And that sort of thing, which was a problem during the 1906 earthquake because you need water to fight the fires. The other problem is with ground failures, landslides in our hills, and so we have managed to do some modelling around this so people can have the shaking plus the likelihood of these ground failures occurring. It's not all about what happens in the moment of an earthquake. In our case, things are going to keep going on afterwards. There's 2 types of after. There's after slip of the fault. So the Hayward is a creeping fault, which means it doesn't do a nice clean slip. It'll keep slipping for days, weeks after, posing a problem for anything built, foundations on top of it, and roads, pipelines crossing the fault. And we also have an aftershock sequence in our scenario. And we chose the one that comes around into Silicon Valley to keep things interesting, but there's hundreds of thousands of different ways the aftershocks could play out based on the science that we have. As I mentioned before, 1906 fire, there's a photo of it. There's many aspects that lead to the fire. First of all, things, electrical sparks, start fires, gas pipelines start fires. But that's only one part of the problem. The next part is communicating the fire. Do you have communications? Do you have enough fire engines? Do you have water to fight your fire? These are really things which have to be thought through and have been in conversations in the Bay Area, but more is needed. And you can see in the bottom left there some firefighters following one of our workshops were showing how they can take water out of the bay and use that as a source. So these scenarios, they get built up, bottom up from the science. So all the science is laid out now. Then we get into the realm of what does this mean for our infrastructure and what does this mean for society? In particular, some of the themes that we're picking out that are sort of new and hopefully cutting edge are interdependencies amongst our infrastructure, communities at risk, people maybe being displaced, and the internet economy, the resilience and vulnerability in that. This is my last slide. So why haywired? So haywired is derived from Haywood, but wired is really getting at this connectedness. So connectedness in the earth with the afterslip and aftershocks, connectedness and amongst the lifelines, connectedness through our technology and internet economy and in our communities. So for the next year, we are building this scenario with a coalition of folks who are coming on board. We had our first meeting in just a week or so ago. 42 organisations have already come together to address some of the new themes in this scenario and take it out to their groups and people who are interested in understanding these problems better and working on solutions. We're aiming to bring it to all public in April 18, 2018, when all the folks who have been involved can share what they have learned and help with the messaging of how we can become more resilient to not just earthquakes, but everything else that can happen around an earthquake that could be a risk from without an earthquake.
Yeah, very good. Anne, thank you. Let me ask you one quick question. I thought it was fascinating that the first slide that you showed had the fault line through the Hayward Fault. When the Bay Area, and this is a pretty intelligent group of folks, everybody knows that there are the two major faults that run through the Bay Area with the other smaller. But there was an adjustment in Loma Prieta. That's what 89 was. Correct me if I'm wrong going on. The Hayward runs through a highly populated, highly populated areas. There's a major danger, not that there's not a major danger from any quake, but there's a major danger on that side of the bay, is there not?
Yeah, you nailed it. The Hayward Fault's the most urbanized fault in the country that we know of.
Yeah, but I mean, it runs under Alta Bates, I think. It runs UC.
Yeah, so UC Berkeley has got the iconic infrastructure investment in their stadium. I forget how many millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent because it sits right on top of the fault.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. In fact, I mean, the Bay Area is legendary already for investing in earthquakes. So some folks have added up $50 billion worth of investment in our infrastructure. At least 25 can be accounted for with BART, water transmission systems, and really critical infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Ann. Just going forward here, I'm going to ask, questions, one question each, and then I'm sure that you guys have questions, and we'll get it there. And then I would like this just to be as informal as we possibly can and just get an exchange of ideas. I'm also thinking that I'm going to ask these guys if they have questions for each other. So everybody have mics then? Are we all good to go? Or we have three, we're going to be sharing? Or okay. All right, we're going to be sharing. So, Rob, why don't I start with you? In our pre-conference call, and we talked a little bit, you talked about expanding the urban area, the growth, and making them more healthy for the environment. Mm-hmm. Is that something that can really gain some progress? I know San Francisco's talked about that, just involved in tree planting and those kinds of things. Is that something that we really need to get to?
I think so, and I think there's a lot of efforts in that direction. I think we are doing that, but there's not in a very systematic, kind of ambitious kind of way that would make. I mean, what would be nice would be to set goals for what we think we actually need, and then work towards those in terms of canopy cover for the cities, or slowing down the water, as it falls on roofs and sidewalks, doing more low-impact development, right? So that it sinks in, recharges groundwater, supports native vegetation, or vegetation, has access to water in the dry season. Yeah, I think there's, the thing is we do rebuild and replant and reshape the cities in a daily way, and probably, so much turns over in the course of a decade. If we thought about that in this context, I think that we could leverage a lot of money we already spend towards more, impactful benefits over time. But it's a challenge, right? Of course, the patchwork of jurisdictions, the difference between public and private, and all the different programs that would need to be coordinating, because we're talking about stormwater, we're talking about urban forestry, we're talking about city planning, we're talking about private developers. And so how do you get that all sort of working towards a coherent common vision? It's the same with the shoreline. The shoreline is managed in all these different segments, but they need to ultimately work together, or else it's not going to be a coherent system. It's going to, we build up over here, it reflects, energy over there, or there's a low spot over here. So I think that's a great challenge for us as a region. It's great to be talking about it as a region. And I do believe there's huge potential. There's a lot of ingenuity, creativity. There's a lot of resources, and we are doing stuff. But I think we need events like this, and then we need to actually kind of have working groups or plans or visions that implement these things.
Okay. Brad, the seawall. When I first started looking at this, and I've been here for a long time, and I've watched. And what most people, I think, see is when at real high tide and in storm, they see the water coming up over the Embarcadero. You hear about the risk. You hear about liquefaction. The slide that Ann showed about the Marina District. But I don't think that we really understand what's going on and what's out there and what can protect us and what the danger is. Where do we go first with business, with just citizens? Where do we go first to get the word out? I know you guys try, you have a major effort, but where do we go? How can we all help, I guess is my question.
It's a good question. I think we were talking before about risk communication and how you talk to the public about sea level rise and seismic risk in a way that engages people and doesn't scare them too much. I find with sea level rise, we show these maps, inundation maps a lot, and I think people have a hard time imagining what that means. I think we can end up producing a lot of fear for people when we just show those inundation maps. And there's going to be a competition that is going to be happening around the Bay Area, resilient by design, that will involve all the Bay Area counties, and we'll invite teams in to come and look at areas that may be subject to flood risk associated with sea level rise, and go beyond just showing what the risk is on maps, but to start to envision the kind of new waterfronts that we need, new shoreline areas that we need, whether they're nature-based or in more developed areas, so that people can see what the solution might be. So I think that's the next step in terms of raising awareness. It's engaging people and not just a discussion about risk, but what the solutions are to that risk.
So I don't want to be let me follow up for just a second. I'm sorry. I don't want to be a butthead, but I remember when we were taking down the freeway, the Embarcadero Freeway, and we were going to put in the Embarcadero, and Willie Brown, our esteemed mayor, was very proud of the palm trees that he brought in. And making it into an escalade or whatever he wanted to make, like Paris. At that point, we didn't do enough, did we, to seawalls, to do that when we were building the Embarcadero, or did we?
I I don't think Robin would have chosen those palm trees, I'm guessing. It's a good question. Some of this data about the geotech qualities of the Embarcadero, the fill, has been around for quite a while. And when we were in that sort of post-earthquake crisis after Loma Prieta, I think the city did the best that it could to tear down the freeway and build a beautiful new roadway with a great promenade, but they didn't address the seismic risk as fully as we would hope today. And maybe there were just not the resources to be able to do it. I think the state and federal funding for the Embarcadero roadway project was something like $600 million at the time. And I think it's been a fantastic success for the city. And maybe that was that generation's challenge, and our generation's challenge is to address the seismic risk.
You're a good man. I didn't mean to be taking a shot at Willie, but then I think he can probably absorb it. I'm sorry, Scott, you had a question?
No, I was just going to follow on to what he had said. I mean, I find it very interesting about the sea level rise and the potential seawall. And I was speaking to some folks out before the conference started, and they were mentioning that effective seawall would have to be 15 to 20 feet high, or to that to take care of the rising water and the king tide and so forth. And if we could get that out to the masses and let them know that, I think that would raise some concern. They say, oh my gosh, we're talking that big a wall. How's that going to work? So those types of communications that you're talking about, getting those out, if we can do more of that, I mean, that would be helpful. I find that it's very difficult just to get people to work on business continuity plans. I mean, everyone knows that earthquakes are a huge exposure to the Bay Area, and I think we're just doing a poll on it. But given the fact of the high probability of that earthquake coming, there's very few organizations that actually have these earthquake plans or business continuity plans in place yet. So I think it's just an inherent problem that we have, and it's always like everyone's too busy, and you need to have some of the top issues float to the top, and some of the seawall and the sea level rise is just not getting there yet.
It is, and I want to ask Ann her question, so let me do that, see if I can remember. But dump some of this stuff on my desk going forward, will you? And we'll see, maybe, I mean, there are organizations here, RTNDA and Radio and Television News Directors Association, that I'll be starting on this. The media should be working to get this information out in not a scary way, you're right, because the media has a tendency to be very scary. I mean, it sells newspapers and hell, it's what we do sometimes. But we want to do it in a really responsible way. Yeah, the poll question that was referred to up there, you guys know how to do this. Does your business or organization have a post-disaster continuity plan in place? So if you want to participate in that. Ann, I want to ask you, sure, that's good timing. Let's get you when you're drinking. Let me ask you, I didn't ask you the question here. If you had your own universe now, what project would you be working first? What would you like to see getting done here?
It's a great question. So first of all, you want to think about the people who live here, right? And a lot of investments have been made, as I said, in the big infrastructure. So water transmission, bridges, some of BART and such. But there's still a lot of homes out there, and unfortunately with lower income people living in them. So I think, and there's a big push, ABAG and the California Earthquake Authority are making a big push to try and help people be aware of their problem and strengthen their homes and provide incentives to do that. So that's definitely high up in the list. I think the other thing I'd like to bring to your attention is water. Because power and telecom, I mean, they will be out in places and take some time to get back, but they will come back in a reasonably nimble way, maybe weeks. But water distribution is months. And we know that from other earthquakes around the world, and we just know that from our models. We know how many breaks we're going to have. We know how many old pipes are in the ground and how they respond to shaking and liquefaction. So if somehow that process of replacing water distribution could be sped up, I think right now it's like they can do 1% a year. That would, every new pipe will really help. With water is essential.
Okay. Then let me throw out to any of you. Corporations, I mean, we see on the back of the program, PG&E, chipping in to try to do these kinds of things. Are large corporations, and I want to go to other businesses, are they aware? Are they helping as they go about their daily business of trying to make money for their shareholders and just running a business? You feel that the business community is helping out in any way in any of these concerns at all? Anybody want to jump? Or?
Well, just speaking for San Francisco, we have a very engaged business community, and the city, I think, has been pretty proactive among local jurisdictions in terms of addressing seismic risk. So, new hospital, the water systems being rebuilt in the city, or it has largely been rebuilt. The sewer system is on the way to being rebuilt. And the business community has been great in terms of supporting those investments in infrastructure. And so without them, we can't get the word out. Right. So in San Francisco, I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
You know, and I also might add, the PG&E, and they've done an excellent job. I know that they've partnered with the Red Cross and given quite a bit of money to help with Plan Bay Area. So basically, it's helping organizations, the community, businesses plan for an earthquake, and helping them put together business continuity plans, family preparedness plans, and so forth. So those types of organizations are definitely giving back. And, we'd like to see more organizations like PG&E do that.
And Scott said it before, though, it's really the small businesses. And when you add up how many people are employed in small businesses in the Bay Area, it's a lot of people. And that's one area we're trying to reach with our scenario, working through California Resilience Alliance, who has their reach into the businesses.
Yeah, Rob?
Yeah, one example, we've been working with Google on advising their campus redevelopment, and they have really embraced the idea of ecological resilience and landscape resilience, in that as these large landholders reshape, landscapes, particularly around the edge of the bay, they can be part of the solution in terms of what they plant, how they design the relationship to the bay, to the creek. So that's been a nice example of leveraging activity that's already going on to build that next generation of more resilient systems.
Okay, and one more, and then if you guys have your questions ready, we can try to do that there. The elephant in the room, and I think for anybody in California trying to do anything regarding climate change or whatever, is going to be, quite frankly, the federal government, and how we are going to navigate the system with the Trump administration. For political reasons, for a lot of different reasons. I mean, he's talking now, he said he hasn't decided, which I saw as a good sign. Excuse me, I know news people are not supposed to have opinions. About maybe not now pulling out of the Paris climate change. He's going to wait until the end, till he goes to Geneva. I think it's for the G7. So maybe that's a crack, but I mean, he campaigned on the fact that climate change didn't exist. Are we going to be able to even look to the federal government for money? Do you see that happening? Does that concern you? Where do we go? How do we navigate? And what are your thoughts? Anybody? Sure. Brad, you want to go?
The port just went back to Washington, D.C. Because of the seawall project and our need to try and start soliciting federal dollars for the project. We view it as a multi-year effort. We did hear some strange feedback, talk about flood control, not sea level rise, which just seems sort of ridiculous. So many federal agencies have really embraced the concept of sea level rise that it seems counterintuitive that we would stop talking about it. There's not enough federal funding to go around with other competing interests like tax cuts. We're interested to see what the infrastructure bill may hold. But we have heard it's a lot focused on tax credits and public-private partnerships, so not the kind of thing that we could take advantage of for a project like the seawall. My feeling is we're going to have some trouble over the next couple of years, but federal funding is really an effort that takes place over a decade or more. So I'm hopeful that we'll come out of this period quickly.
And sometimes what I think these days what we're hearing from the president is not what the policy that's actually coming out of the administration, if that makes any sense at all. So.
And I guess just to add, obviously we do need the federal dollars, but I think there's a lot we can do as California, as the Bay Area, in leading the way and kind of keeping these things moving forwards despite. And I think a lot of people are looking to us as a model internationally that the U.S. can keep moving forwards. And, and within the country, we may be able to put forth some of the important models that kind of keep the momentum up. And then as the administrations shift over time, as resources come back.
I think we're going to see less and less funding from the federal government. We're already seeing some decline in OSHA, just really kind of following up on OSHA safety issues. We help a lot of our clients kind of prevent some of these audits, but we're seeing less and less of those audits, just less enforcement, less regulation. I think that's kind of what we see in the future.
And it's also about being able to find the money or know where it is and how to get it. So ABAG, Association Bay Area Governments, is holding a workshop. I know they might have already had it, but exactly this question: how can you find the money? And another thing is being ready to knowing where you want to spend the money and being ready for that. So the local has a mitigation planning process in each county. There's a place for that to happen. Counties can be aware and prioritize their risks and be ready to apply for funds, and especially after a disaster, also be ready to know what they want to do with money, and that's really important. You can't do all that in the moment of a disaster.
Okay. The poll question that's up there now, if you're seeing it, who should finance flood protection efforts around the Bay? So if you want to participate in that. And I don't know exactly how this is going to work. I'd like to take some questions out here. Anybody have any questions? John, you have the mic? Yeah. Anybody? Any questions? Here we go.
Hello, my name is Matt Warteen with Burns McDonnell. My question's for Scott. On the insurance side, I was curious to see if you guys are assessing the benefits of making energy resiliency a priority for large tech companies like whether it's Google or Amazon. And so, for example, giving them deductions or monetizing when they make investments for things like microgrids.
That's a good question. And, I don't know the full answer. I have not seen those types of credits being laid out for those types of items as of yet. There's always discussion with the carriers and the different new programs that may be coming up. That might be something in the future. I do see credits now being had for improving your infrastructure around resiliency. So maybe more business continuity plans in place may conjure up maybe a 5% credit back from the carriers or what have you on certain types of portfolios that a client might have. But unfortunately, I have not seen that as of yet. I don't know if anybody else has an answer for that.
Okay.
You might ask the guy right next to you. He's the real insurance guru.
Oh, wow. Okay, John?
Hi, Will Travis. I was just curious if any of you know how the insurance industry is going to be dealing with sea level rise. Will they stop writing policies? Will they offer insurance? And what probabilities and projections will they use?
Well, at least from my standpoint, that discussion really hasn't come up very often. I mean, right now, I think the carriers are looking at an annual renewal perspective, looking at the risk on an annual basis. So the climate change or sea rise issue has not been factored into the current year's premium. Now, obviously, organizations, as if sea level rise starts to increase and some of their properties become exposed, then there may be some issues that may need to be addressed. But I have not seen that as of yet, and I don't know if you guys have run across that in your dealings at all.
Well, I know that I'm curious to hear from you about how big a role private insurance plays in flood insurance. We have the National Flood Insurance Program, so the federal government's sort of insurer of last resort, and they put out flood risk maps. If you're in a flood risk area, you're required to purchase insurance, and there may be building code requirements in those flood-prone areas. So far, FEMA is not including sea level rise projections on those flood insurance rate maps. That's a change that I think would help prospective buyers understand that over time they might become prone to flood risk.
Yeah, I agree.
It is a slippery slope, even just with the private insurance, with homeowner insurance. I'm a guy who had water damage 3 times this winter, and going through that maze of going, wait a minute, this is not covered, that's not covered. That's a great question, because it's something that really needs to be addressed. Needs to be addressed, just But anyway, I still haven't worked it out. Did you have something else that you wanted to say, or no? Okay. Do we have? I saw another hand out there.
Jeff Rhodes, Resilient Shore. This is a question for Robin. It seems that one of the challenges that we face for resiliency design has to do with replacement of one type of habitat with another. We can look to the snowy plower example next to Facebook. Clearly, there are thoughts about extending ecotones or horizontal levees out into subtidal waters. How do we get around mitigating for existing habitat as well as creating new habitat? How do we find common ground with many of the non-governmental environmental organizations who seem to be so opposed to this sort of thing?
Yikes. That's a good question. A lot of people in the audience can answer this one as well or better than I can. I come back around to that each party in these difficult negotiations does have a role to play and is playing that role and has a job to do, often legally or otherwise. And part of the problem is often the scale that we're working at. If we're zoomed in on one particular property and a small area, it's hard to fix the problem. They're more complex than that. I come back around to something Brad said about developing visions that are broad enough and positive enough that everybody can buy in. I do think the regulatory and the environmental advocates deserve to be able to see how is this going to play out positively in the longer run. Because if that's the argument that's being made, this trade-off is worthwhile. We're going to get a short-term loss but a long-term benefit. That needs to be really laid out, and often that needs to probably require us to think at a somewhat bigger spatial and temporal scale, leverage a few different projects together. That's one of the ways we've been having some success at this issue, is convening a lot of the stakeholders, including the scientists, and choosing a big enough bite around the edge of the bay. We call them operational landscape units. So the idea that we need to come up with a vision for each of these different chunks of shoreline around the bay and have us all kind of buy into that. And it's going to take a couple decades to get there in multiple projects. And then there's going to be trade-offs or different approaches that make sense within that. But if we're clear that the overall benefit is going to be worth it, that may facilitate these interactions because people don't feel like they're losing as much or risking as much.
Yeah, and that brings up, a real key fact in planning, in mitigation of short-term versus long-term. And the balancing act. I would assume that all of you guys have that problem. And Ann, if I can ask you, the looking at, we could have something happen right now while we're here. We need to be prepared for that, but we need to also be prepared down the road. Is that obviously that's a challenge? But how do you balance that?
Yeah. So you mean with earthquakes in particular?
Well, yeah, and preparation for it and things that we do, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. So if a large earthquake happens, we will have a lot of short-term risk. It will be right in our face. But how I like to think about it is like all hazards. So when you prepare for an earthquake, you prepare for other hazards. if you have a mask for a pandemic, you also have a mask for the dust that could be in the air on a windy day after buildings have collapsed. So you need water for everything. Fire extinguisher you should have, in your home anyway. So I think just thinking all hazards will cover a lot of the bases.
Okay.
So we're grappling with this question in terms of, we've got a seismic project. We know that we have to stabilize the seawall and the foundation of the Embarcadero. But we also are seeing that emerging flood risk along the waterfront. And this is a generational project. So how much sea level rise protection do we build into the project? You'd think the easy answer is the most possible right away. But we have a historic district, right? So we have these beautiful historic buildings that are the Embarcadero Historic District. And it's really hard to think about how you change the elevation of those piers and bulkhead buildings. So we're grappling with, what amount of sea level rise adaptation do we plan for now? Do we build something that is further adaptable in the future, that could be raised in the future? It's going to be one of the most complicated discussions that we have in this project with the historic preservation community, with the regulatory community. And so I really look forward to that conversation and whatever the solution is to that problem.
Yeah, I think the big issue right now with organizations is limited resources. You only have so many dollars to play with, and long-term versus short-term. Unfortunately, it comes down to probability, and what's the highest probability of the risk occurring, and what's the biggest damage that will happen to your organization. And that's typically where the money flows. Sometimes it's going to be, in most cases that I see right now, it's more on the short-term side of it. The long-term aspects kind of get on the back burner. They'll say, hey, we'll take care of that tomorrow. But right now we have this burning issue. I don't know if I have a solution for that, but that's just the way it happens.
Yeah, it would seem to be sitting around a table and trying to figure it out. I want to follow up a little bit on cybersecurity with that, but is there anything out here? I want to keep everybody involved.
One question here. Brian Hubbinger with Chevron. Question around the Bay Area voters approved Prop AA last year, a multi-county tax for a lot of the projects that you were discussing. Can you talk about the projects that are going to most benefit from that additional revenue, and how it's going to move the needle as far as these projects or other projects in the future?
Well, we have some people here who can speak about that really well. The projects haven't been determined yet, but I think, it will support a lot of the kinds of things we're talking about: tidal marsh restoration, flood protection at the shoreline edge. So a lot of the things. So it's a great step forward. But I think it's also recognized it's not enough. It's kind of a local down payment on what's needed. And I think it is a great example of that we do need to support things locally probably a lot of the time nowadays, and even more. But it's going to take a lot more resources to really pull it off, the kinds of things we're talking about.
Anybody else on that question? Okay.
Just to put a point on it, it's $25 million a year over how many years? 20 or 30?
20, it's 500 million.
500 million, so it could maybe pay for the one project that Robin was talking about, the salt bay, the salt ponds.
Yeah. Tough bite on the taxpayer, but not a whole lot of revenue coming out of it. Let me just question, Scott. The cybersecurity. I always try to imagine, and maybe it's just being born in Hollywood or something. The fight that is going on now, you had it up on that one slide talking about cyber warfare, and I mentioned a little earlier, shutting down not only internet companies and food deliveries and but power grids. They said that the next World War III is not going to be fought, with nuclear weapons. It's going to be fought through technology. Is it war rooms? I mean, is that really what's going on? Is it like preparing for battle or being in battle now?
Well, I'm not sure about the government's perspective, but from an organization perspective, there's a war every day against people trying to hack into your network. And they have IT folks that are putting in controls and trying to help avoid a catastrophe with the network. So those battles and battlegrounds are already happening. And what we're seeing right now is obviously a big trend towards making the network stronger, especially smaller organizations now getting into making sure they can put the mitigation efforts into their network infrastructure. So I guess the answer is yes, there are some battlegrounds out there.
Yeah, okay, and I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I mean, shutting down the power grid would be a major hit to the United States. And you said you didn't want to talk about government, but how big a policy do you see or think or should there be out there in fighting this? I mean, and looking at it.
Well, there's really no policies out there. It's best practices right now. There's a lot of pressure from a standpoint of being part of the community. Just like business continuity plans, you try to tell the infrastructure you need to have a plan for resiliency around, if in case something bad happens and a cyber breach is something bad would happen. We came across a client back in Michigan that had a cyber attack, which the folks came in and were wanted money to bring back the keys to the network. So it's happening, and it's a little nerve-wracking to think about it, but that they were able to get into the infrastructure of the corporate headquarters, but not the power grid itself.
Okay, you're in the private sector. Would you welcome government help and government coming in and saying that we're going to, I mean, if you have Russia hacking into, and we haven't seen the final answer on this, but the U.S. election process, the French election process, I mean, is it time for the government to, I don't know, whether the FBI or what it would be, to step up and say, we're going to help you guys, or do you not want the government involved?
I think organizations right now are trying to prevent that by doing it themselves. And so hopefully they're trying to self-monitor, self-correct so that they don't get those types of regulations impeded onto their progress. I mean, that when you get the government involved, it's going to cost them more money. So I think the community right now is looking at how we fix this before somebody steps in.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting it. I was just asking the question. Anybody else here? Should we go back out here? Here, let's go back here.
I'm Ann Cook with the Port of San Francisco, and I have a question. I think it's for Robin. A lot of the projects that many of us in the room work on are hardscape projects, and when we're thinking about how we can make those better for the Bay environment, what should we be looking at for examples? For example, you showed your marshlands projects, you talked about that, and those we can see around the Bay, but when it comes to improvements we could be doing in our seawall projects, in our sort of other hardscape projects, are you working on examples that we could be looking at, or are there other organizations that could help us when we're working with the public to understand how we could be doing this better?
Well, I think I heard the question. It's, I think we have a lot of concepts and more examples about what we can do to protect shorelines using nature-based approaches in the broader, shallower areas where we have former salt ponds or we have marshes already. In these places where we built out, so San Francisco did used to have those marshes and shallow bays, but we built out to the deeper water, as Brad nicely explained, to get nice access to the deep water, which now means we put ourselves somewhat in harm's way by building out to the deeper water where the waves are. And so we do have less, we sort of removed that option of building nice big mud flats and marshes in front. So it is a tougher question of, is there a nature component to that? And probably not as much, certainly, as in the other areas where you just have room to knock down the waves. So there's just not as much room to work with. That said, I'm really curious about that too. There are, habitats that occur in higher energy areas. They're, in our slightly deeper waters in the Central Bay, oysters and eelgrass and things like that. And I've been, curious about those. One example that's interesting is the Seattle, the seawall in Seattle that has, built in quite a bit of habitat benefits into it. And it seems like that's been a pretty popular, successful example. They had alcoves and they kind of set it back some distance in some places so they could sort of build out, get a little bit of room back to work with. So, I think I mean, I'm really curious, Brad, like, this is the opportunity here to explore all those potentials, probably, and he probably knows much more about around the world what the possibilities are. So I'll give it to him.
Well, we have looked at Seattle. They had a break in their salmon run. So there was a need for habitat to solve that problem with the run. So they designed their seawall to create that habitat. They also, there's a problem with these areas, these constructed areas where you have piers or wharves over a bay area. You create dead zones because there's no light. And so they used some glass in their wharf areas to create penetration of light. And these are the kinds of ideas that we know that we're going to have to explore and get a lot more expert at the port. Are there living shoreline opportunities that we could pursue along with the seawall project? We do have the problem with the sort of deep water right at the edge. And so how we navigate that transition is going to be really challenging.
Anybody else? And I have a question for you. What would you suggest now if you had a magic bullet that and I know that there are regulations and businesses are trying to be prepared for what can, or I guess you'll tell us will happen. What would you like to see done? Tell businesses, what do they need to do now in mitigation?
Definitely plan and think about how you will carry on without certain things, important things. But I don't really consider myself an expert. This is why we have built this coalition, to bring in people who are already know how to talk to a business and already know some of these issues and will be able to translate what we do and to help them move forward. So, I mean, there's a lot out there already on business continuity, which is all good stuff, but I really feel like the action's not going to come from USGS, it's going to come from these translators. Yeah.
Okay, right. Okay, yeah, Scott?
Yeah, I might just add on to that. I agree with you 100%. I think what we all need to do is, at least from an organizational standpoint, to develop those committees, like a committee that looks into this. You have key people from key functions within your organization attend this committee that gets together on a quarterly basis to talk about their planning activities. What should they be doing to help prepare for some of these upcoming events, like an earthquake? Do they have a business continuity plan? What are those types of programs they need to have in place, and help drive the development of those programs within their organization? And also attend great sessions like this today, right?
Okay. Even if we do say ourselves. Yes, question here, please.
The Bay Area is acknowledged to be sort of the center of innovation. We're hearing it in what's being discussed today, both in this panel and those who are attending. Is there an equal effort in looking at innovation regarding the financing, whether it's in the Bay Area or around the world? Because there's your planning design, there's the ecosystems, you're doing all of that regarding the design, but can there be an equal effort regarding innovation regarding the financial tools, whether it's P3 or other things, not just in the Bay Area? Because with the confusion in Washington and the doubt that's there, and a desire to, as we heard earlier, to have greater control over our own destiny locally, are there things that we can tap around the world regarding the financial side and people being equally innovative regarding the financing?
Go ahead, Brett.
So we're thinking about this in the context of the seawall project, $3 to $5 billion. We're not going to be able to fund it locally. We're seeing that there's not a lot of built-in funding sources to address sea level rise. You know, Measure AA was maybe one of the first to look at a local funding source to deal with, you know, habitat areas, marshes, to try and make them a little bit more resilient. So we put together a finance working group with the city to go through 40 ideas about how we might finance the seawall and rating them in terms of revenue, political risk, can we get them adopted, sustainability, things like that. This is a conversation that has to expand outward, to the, we're going to take it up to the state level. We've already started talking to the State Lands Commission. There needs to be this kind of creative discussion. If it's not happening in DC, we need to have it happen at the state level. And I think for these kinds of infrastructure investments, it's taxes. There are a few financing vehicles that the federal government has explored this through transportation and water. There's TIFIA and WIFIA, where the federal government will provide debt, really low-cost debt, basically at treasury rates, to finance certain transportation projects and water projects, but those are just cheap loans. You have to have a source to repay.
Yeah, I can add to that. So there is something quite innovative being done. And there's a lot of uninsured earthquake losses in the Bay Area. The penetration rate for earthquake insurance is 10% if we're lucky, I think. So there are some people have been working on something called parametric something. Anyway, it's going to be a new way of, a new style of insurance, which sort of keys off of like maybe the USGS shake map of the earthquake to determine your payment. So the idea is to be able to streamline insurance, and I wish I could explain it better, but look up parametric insurance or something like that.
Hey, Ann, let me follow up with that.
Yeah.
How close are we getting, and this is probably a heretic question, we keep getting better to being able to predict, okay? How will the business community, how do you foresee, or how does USGS see the warning of a quake coming and mitigation and alerting businesses?
All right, so there's two things. There's prediction being, you're using it in the sense of earthquake early warning, so we already know there's been an earthquake, and you've got those seconds of time to tell people. Yeah, so that's really going on right now. And we have some beta testers who are using the system already, like Bart, who are thinking about how they will use it to reduce the risk. For each one of us, we will know for sure this is an earthquake, because imagine how much time it takes you sometimes to realize that it is an earthquake. And secondly, will give us more time to protect ourselves. So just for each person in the room, you'll have more time to avoid something falling on top of you and injuring you. And then at the same time, companies like PG&E are looking at this and thinking about, there's various ideas of, if you shut down certain things before an earthquake takes it out, it will avoid fires, and you'll be able to get it back up faster. So right now it's kind of in the domain of the users and some key users.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but we also do something called forecasting, which is kind of the 72% number that you brought up, Brad. And after a large earthquake, we can do forecasting of how much the rate of earthquakes has changed. So for our haywire scenario, after that magnitude 7 on the Hayward Fault, the rate of earthquakes is 10,000 times what it was the day before. And it's very important for people to know that it's really risky right now, and don't go running through buildings. So, but the good news is that earthquake statistics all over the world show that there's a very strong decay in the rate of the earthquakes. So it's this is something people can learn now ahead of time and know how to use this information ahead of time.
Okay, very good. Yeah, question here.
Yes, thank you. Scott Warner with Ramble. Ed, you had asked the panel what advice they could give to businesses to be prepared. My question is for the panel, what advice do you have to our regulatory community to help them work with you better from the standpoint of getting these projects built, correctly and with less time, so that we actually, every day is a day closer to the next disaster. We have to be able to move, perhaps a little bit more quickly.
Good question. Let's go. All right. Brad, you want to go? Yeah.
Sure. The port, being right by the bay, is a highly regulated environment. We work with BCDC, the Regional Water Board, Army Corps of Engineers when we're considering fill in the bay. We don't know whether or not our seawall project is actually going to involve new bay fill. Could be that we're stabilizing land. But we're going to be working in the water somewhat because we have these marginal wharves and piers that are pile supported, and those piles need to be strengthened along with the project. And the regulatory time frame it's intensive for a project like this. It's going to be many years of, we're going to have CEQA review, NEPA review, and we're racing against that next earthquake, right? We're trying to build these improvements before that earthquake occurs. I think it's a two-way street. I think it's not just encouraging the regulatory community to speed things up. I think it's on us as well to come up with great environmental enhancement ideas that make the project something that our regulatory partners want to buy into, that the environmental community wants to see happen. So I think that's the way to make it really speed up, is to be creative ourselves about how we minimize impacts and enhance the environment.
Okay, anybody else? Go out there. Okay. All right, John. Yeah.
Hi, the state of California is a net payer into the National Flood Insurance Program. Bay Area residents spend over $25 million annually in NFIP payments. And over the course of the history of the San Francisco, or of the state NFIP program, we've paid in billions more than we have received in NFIP claims payments. As a result, there is a proposal for a state flood insurance program. This is for the person from Marsh. How would you feel about a state flood insurance program? And do you have any ideas about how it should be rolled out?
Boy, I think I understood. How would you want the state involved? Is that basically? Yeah.
State Alternative Fund. So so obviously individual organizations can go out and buy flood insurance at this point in time. Yeah, having more options is always good. I think if that's something that could be pursued, that might be another avenue for those with a higher risk. I mean, as we see, as the question was asked earlier about the sea level rise, and there may be some issues in the future, that might be an avenue that might need to be pursued, where carriers will basically say, high risk, I'm not going to insure you. But however, that organization still needs to have some kind of a protection. So I don't know if we're there yet, but that could be an avenue to pursue in the future.
And how is that working with the California earthquake? I mean, basically you have that for earthquake insurance now, don't you? Is that I don't want to put you on kind of a spot, but I mean, is that working? That's basically along that line, or am I missing the point?
It is along that line, and they are working very hard to really diversify their portfolios so that they can attract more people. But the issue is by the time you take out, when you consider how much you're paying, you take out your deductible, earthquakes are kind of an all or nothing situation. So either you really have to be badly damaged to get something back, or you don't get something back. And this has been the difficulty with the policies, and that's what they've been trying to offer, different ways around that. Because some people will look at the policy and say, well, I think I'd rather put that money into building my house stronger, which is also a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, the deductibles, and the hit that I hear, in the media is that you're right. The deductible is so much. There are caps that are so much. So, again, I guess we're getting down to cost in all of that. But I hope, did that come close to answering your question? Okay. All right. Is there another one? I think we have 5 minutes left. I would like, unless I'm not seeing anything, I promise you guys I give you a chance to ask each other questions here. Is there anybody that wants to ask a question? Just flush out anything that we've been talking about, or no?
Well, actually, I heard some great things about the seawall. I'm just was curious about the risk communication aspects of it. How are we going to notify everyone about what's going on? Because this today was really kind of a great informative or information for me, and I was just curious how we're going to get that word out.
We've been struggling with this. The damage from the seawall moving in an earthquake could be quite high. Going back to Seattle, you can find this online. They created a little video of what would happen to the Seattle waterfront in a major seismic event. Really scary video. And maybe it was effective, right? I think it got played on local TV. They passed their bond by an overwhelming margin, and so maybe you just scare the heck out of people. But I think we want to be more thoughtful about it. Share information, give people a clear image of what the risk is, maybe focus more on the solution and in particular how we can make it a better waterfront. So I think that's how we're thinking about it right now.
But I want to go you have something, Ann?
I was going to follow up, yeah. Do you understand the fragility of the seawall? So if I gave you ground motions, could you tell me how it performs?
I couldn't, but our engineer, project manager could, so.
So maybe you could come in with us on the haywire scenario, because there's not a lot happening. I mean, San Francisco will have problems, but a lot of it's happening over on the East Bay, obviously. So it could be something for San Francisco.
We would love to partner with you.
One of the questions that I wrote down here was, do you have your concern that keeps you up at night? But I've watched you guys and gotten to know you just over the past hour and a half, and I don't think you probably lose sleep a lot about stuff. But just going down real quickly, well, if you do lose sleep, let us know without getting too personal. But or what you, well, never mind. Go down. Yeah, I know. But just your major concern now, what has to be done right now? As we walk out, we've seen the risks, you've talked about the mitigation. What do we take away in your specific area? What do we take away here when we walk outside? What do we take back to wherever we work or whatever we manage or whatever?
Well, I just worry about, or I encourage us to think boldly and try to really deal with this longer term challenges. It's going to be so much easier for us to deal with them than our kids to deal with them, or the next generation. And it really is hard to do that. The tendency is to put off the long term stuff. I do it too. First, it's easy. But we have so much more opportunities now to do positive, proactive solutions than if we let sort of go business as usual and do the cheaper fixes right now, then it's going to be much harder to fix. There won't be time to build the ecosystem solutions. The threats will be too big. We'll just have to try to engineer our way out of it really fast. We won't have time for the kind of processes to make the kind of bay that we want. So how do we proactively kind of push ourselves to think 50 years out in the future and try to at least do the investments that poise us for the next round of investments?
Okay, Brad?
I think we see that the major funding sources that exist today are for after the disaster. We have a major earthquake in the Bay Area and we have billions of dollars of damage. The federal government will come in. And what I think our major takeaway is investing now, whether it's the individual homeowner or it's the city doing the seawall project, is much more economically efficient. And so we should all be focused on that in upfront investment in resiliency.
Okay, Ann?
Yeah, Bay Area economist Steve Levy, to support you on that, says, we can provide jobs now for the middle-income folks, and that'll be more effective than afterwards when the labour force will have to come in from outside to deal with it all. So it's a nice economic argument. I guess what I ask for is people to come together. We're trying to provide this scenario that crosses all the boundaries of science, engineering, environment, economy, communities, and if you want to participate, I think you'll have a good experience learning from the different perspectives, and also get some energy about what to do next.
Okay, Scott?
Okay, so what keeps me up at night? I sleep pretty good, but what keeps me up at night? Have I done everything that I need to do to be prepared, right? The survey that was given out to everybody, it looks like not a lot of folks have actually got a family preparedness plan. What we heard today is that, at least from an earthquake perspective, the earthquake's going to happen. So everyone should think about their own family preparedness plan. Go home this evening, talk about it, figure out what that might be. Survival kit. figure out, talk to your family members and identify a central contact person. Maybe Aunt Judy back in Kansas, you all call them after a major earthquake. Let me know what's happened to you. Identify a payphone in your neighborhood, which there's not very many of those anymore. But find out where that is, because there'll be emergency phones at the time of an event like an earthquake. Work out the plan.
Yeah, all right. Hey, guys, thank you so much, Robin and Brad and Scott. Thank you very much. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, let's thank Ed Baxter and our esteemed panelists again for that great discussion. Thank you.